Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take complex academic material and, well, crystallize it for you. If you're navigating the, let's face it, demanding world of master's or PhD research, you probably already know success isn't just about brilliance, it's often more about discipline structure. So today we're doing a critical deep dive. We're looking at the blueprint for postgraduate scientific research. We'll dissect the philosophical differences between quantitative and qualitative methods. And crucially, we'll cover the rigorous etiquette needed for formal academic writing.
That's exactly the mission. We're definitely moving beyond, shall we say, standard undergraduate expectations here. We need to get into the granular detail required at the postgraduate level. For anyone tackling a thesis or a dissertation, a really thorough methodological grasp of these processes is, well, it's non-negotiable. It isn't simply about gathering information, is it? It's about applying systematic planning, adhering to strict rules, methodological rules to ensure your contribution is academically sound. And that holds true whether your research question demands numerical objectivity or perhaps profound interpretive depth.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that a bit. A central message that seems to run through our sources this week is this idea that scientific research, the kind that gets published or gets your dissertation approved, it's fundamentally different from how we learn things day to day. It's a process-driven activity, isn't it? It requires that structured discipline. So let's start at the beginning. Planning. The sources really hammer home the absolute necessity of a disciplined plan. You need it for effectiveness, for efficiency, for someone starting, say, a 2 or 3 year doctoral project. What are the specific dangers, maybe even existential dangers, if they don't implement a really robust methodological plan?
The danger, quite frankly, as the sources make clear, is complete project collapse. It's as serious as that. Think about it. A dissertation or a major research article, it's a complex project. Multiple stages, loads of moving parts, dependencies. Without a detailed roadmap, you simply cannot effectively anticipate or solve the problems that will inevitably arise. And they always do, don't they? Ethical review delays, maybe data access falls through, unexpected methodological hurdles.
Because research is inherently messy, isn't it? It's never quite a straight line from A to B.
Exactly. It's never straightforward. The plan acts as a vital risk mitigation tool. If you have that structured framework, maybe we're using project management techniques, a Gantt chart, perhaps a peer analysis, something like that, then a problem becomes a deviation, something you can track, manage, and hopefully fix within a defined time frame. But without that structure, those same deviations can quickly spiral into insurmountable obstacles, things that genuinely prevent you from finishing your work. So, systematic planning. It essentially transforms unavoidable problems into manageable challenges.
Right, that makes sense. And that structural rigor must define the steps to follow. Once you have that methodical plan locked down, what's the complete sort of non-negotiable sequence for high-quality scientific research?
It is a critical sequence, yes, and every single element has to be executed properly, flawlessly, ideally. After establishing the plan, the researcher moves through first data collection and then rigorous analysis of that data. And finally, there's interpretation, evaluation, and reporting. This last stage is where you formulate your conclusions, you meticulously explain the significance of your results, and crucially, you detail the study's original contribution, how it impacts the existing body of knowledge. A weak link anywhere in that chain really compromises the quality of the whole study.
Okay, let's focus on data collection for a moment, because this is often where the beautiful plan meets, well, the harsh reality. We need to talk about source accessibility and, maybe more importantly, quality. The modern academic faces both a quality dilemma and this volume problem, as the sources put it.
They certainly do. In this digital age, we have quite staggering accessibility to sources. Journals, books, institutional data, the internet, it's all out there. And this is a big tail story, but the sources remind us that accessibility does not equate to reliability. Not at all. A professional, quality academic contribution demands quality data. Full stop. If the information you're relying on is unsafe, unreliable, perhaps not subject to rigorous peer review, well, you simply can't use it. It inherently jeopardizes the academic validity of your findings.
Which really speaks to the need for things like systematic literature review methods, doesn't it?
Right.
We can't just, Google our way to a PhD thesis.
Precisely. You absolutely can. And this leads us straight into that volume problem, which, as you said, is a dual challenge. The first pitfall is collecting insufficient data. If a researcher just cannot access enough high-quality, relevant sources or perhaps enough empirical data, then they can't adequately define the research problem. They can't conduct the proper analysis needed to sustain a postgraduate level argument. The whole foundation is just too brittle.
But the sources also make a really compelling case that having too much data especially if it's unfiltered, is just as damaging, maybe even more so.
Yes, that excess volume creates what the sources term methodological chaos. If you just hoover up a vast amount of information without systematic filtering, without categorization, without clear selection criteria, if you're mixing primary data, secondary literature, tangential sources, all indiscriminately, the sheer volume just overwhelms you. And that significantly multiplies the difficulty, the time, the effort needed for the analysis phase. It makes everything much harder.
So data management isn't just some technical add-on. It's actually a core methodological skill itself.
Absolutely essential, yes.
Yeah.
The researcher has to actively store, categorize, cross-reference the data they collect, probably using professional tools, citation managers like Zotero, Mendeley, EndNote, whatever works for them. This allows the data to be retrieved efficiently, used at precisely the right moment it's needed in the academic narrative, in the argument. This kind of systematic approach prevents that chaos and maintains the integrity of your research archive.
Okay, and when this disciplined process hopefully reaches its conclusion, what's the expected intellectual product? What's the goal?
Well, while the thesis idea must represent an original contribution, the goal of the research itself is often multifaceted. It's generally aimed at obtaining new knowledge, perhaps developing novel technology, refining existing methods, or maybe even creating new products in some fields. Fundamentally, though, the purpose is to explain the research problem or the area of study in a unique, rigorous, and intellectually defensible way. And in doing so, you're filling a specific gap that you've identified in the existing literature. That's the core idea.
Right. So this systematic planning, this careful data handling, it leads directly to the choice of methodology, that big decision that dictates how we ask questions and how we gather evidence. Let's turn now to that fundamental split, quantitative versus qualitative research paradigms. Let's start with the numerical paradigm, quantitative.
Okay. Quantitative research. It sits very firmly within the post-positivist tradition, generally speaking. Its core definition is that it seeks to objectify facts and events. It does this by placing them in an observable, measurable, and, well, quantitative context. It relies very heavily on numerical data, statistical analysis, mathematical information to express phenomena.
And this is the classic approach we associate with the natural sciences, isn't it? Biology, engineering, physics, where there's an assumption of an objective truth out there that we can measure repeatedly.
That's correct. The purpose of quantitative research is fundamentally to objectively measure, explain, and sometimes even predict social behaviors or natural phenomena. It does this through numerical data, rigorous measurement protocols, controlled experiments, and statistical tests. It's typically deductive in nature. It usually begins with an established theory and a clearly defined hypothesis. The research then aims to test that hypothesis to confirm it or indeed falsify it.
And the core approaches seem to hinge on standardization, don't they? Keeping everything controlled and consistent.
They absolutely must. Yes. Core quantitative approaches involve controlling variables, often through experiments. Using standardized data collection tools, things like validated surveys, scientific apparatus with known calibration, analyzing component parts of a system rather than the whole immediately, and reducing complex data sets down to numerical indicators. These indicators are then used to infer statistical significance, often using things like p-values, confidence intervals, and so on. The key underlying assumption here is that reality is external, it's stable, it's objective, and therefore the primary focus has to be on the method used to measure it reliably.
And that objectivity also defines how you treat the relationship between the variables you're studying.
Precisely. Variables have to be operationalized, defined with exact measurable limits. The whole statistical process really depends on being able to precisely measure the relationship between these variables, whether they show a positive correlation, a negative one, or perhaps no significant relationship at all.
Okay. And what about the researcher's role in this quantitative framework? I imagine they have to maintain a certain distance to avoid influencing the results.
Yes, the quantitative researcher must be deliberately separated, detached from the events and facts they are observing. They need to cultivate an objective, impartial attitude. Their personal beliefs, their perspectives, ideally should not interfere with the collection and analysis of the measurable numerical data. Their job, essentially, is to record and analyze the data according to the predefined, standardized procedures. They act almost as a neutral conduit for the findings.
And the types of questions being asked are probably the clearest indicator of this paradigm.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Quantitative researchers are seeking answers to questions about frequency, magnitude, distribution, things like how many, how much, how often, How common? These are questions where the valid answers must be expressed in quantities and statistics that can be verified and subjected to mathematical scrutiny.
Okay, now let's pivot completely. Let's look at the qualitative research paradigm, the interpretive and holistic approach. This is often framed almost as the opposite, isn't it? Where depth of understanding and context take precedence over breadth and generalization.
Methodologically, yes, it's a radical shift. Qualitative research aligns more with the constructivist or interpretive traditions. It utilizes qualitative data acquisition methods, things like in-depth observation, semi-structured or unstructured interviews, focus groups, detailed document analysis, to reveal perceptions and events within their natural environment. That's key. The aim is a realistic, holistic understanding. It relies fundamentally on verbal information, rich descriptions, observed patterns, narratives, rather than purely numerical data.
And we tend to see this methodology more dominant in fields like social sciences, history, anthropology, where human experience, meaning-making, that sort of thing, are the core subjects.
Exactly. The purpose here isn't measurement in the quantitative sense. It's about interpretation and deep understanding. The aim is really to delve into how individuals create meaning within their own social worlds and how they perceive that world. Crucially, the researcher must work strictly within the natural setting. They have to be incredibly vigilant not to influence or manipulate or distort the environment or the participants' responses. The goal is to capture pure, unadulterated insights into their perspectives.
Could we elaborate a bit on those data collection methods? Because this emphasis on depth must surely affect the scope and scale of the study compared to quantitative work.
It does, significantly. Observation, for instance, to yield meaningful qualitative results is often immensely time-consuming. You might need prolonged exposure to genuinely understand the nuances of, say, human behavior in a specific context or an organizational culture. Interviews need to be specific, intensive, allowing participants to express themselves fully. This often results in large volumes of transcript, data-rich ideas, opinions, stories. While surveys can sometimes bridge both methodologies, in pure qualitative work, the researcher essentially becomes the primary data collection instrument, through their direct engagement, observing, interviewing, interpreting. And that's why sample sizes in purely qualitative studies tend to be much smaller. They prioritize richness and depth of data over statistical generalizability across large populations.
Right. And structurally, it's different too. Qualitative research doesn't typically start with a theory it's trying to prove, does it?
No, generally it's inductive. Qualitative research often ends with concepts, and potentially even the creation of new theories. Grounded theory is probably the classic example of this approach. The researcher starts with the raw data transcripts, field notes, documents, identifies patterns, themes, categories, and then builds theoretical concepts from the bottom up, grounded in that data. The focus is holistic, revealing patterns, pursuing multiplicity and differences in perspectives, and describing the data with a depth and richness that hopefully captures the complexity of the whole phenomenon being studied.
And the underlying philosophical assumption shifts too, doesn't it? From an objective reality out there to something more like a creative or constructed reality where the subject's perception is paramount.
Precisely. Reality, in this view, is seen as creative, as socially constructed by the participants within their context. This means the main methodological focus shifts to the working condition, as the sources put it, the context, the environment, the people being studied, their interactions. Variables are seen as complex, interconnected, highly contextual. This makes trying to isolate and measure them with strict numerical precision quite difficult and perhaps even inappropriate for the research question.
Which brings us to the rather complex role of the qualitative researcher. There seems to be a tricky balance needed between subjective engagement and objective reporting.
This is a really nuanced point, and one that postgraduate students absolutely must get to grips with. Because the researcher is physically present, they're observing, they're interviewing, they inevitably develop a particular kind of relationship with the context and participants. It's participatory, subjective, often requires an empathic attitude. They get close to the data, close to the people. However, and this is critical for academic rigor, while the approach to data gathering might feel subjective, the final academic report must still strive for objectivity. The researcher has to meticulously document their process, their interpretations, and write up what was actually found based on the gathered evidence, regardless of whether it aligns with their initial hunches or personal feelings. That transparency, that commitment to the evidence, is what maintains scholarly integrity in qualitative work.
Okay, and just like on the quantitative side, the kinds of questions asked really illuminate the whole methodology, don't they?
They absolutely do. Qualitative researchers are typically seeking answers that require detailed description, interpretation, exploration of mechanisms. Questions like why, how, in what way, in which way. You simply can't answer complex questions about human motivation or cultural interpretation or lived experience with just a number or a statistic. These questions demand sentences, narratives, detailed observations situated within their specific context. Understanding this fundamental distinction, the how many versus the why and how, is really the key to selecting the right methodology for your specific dissertation or research question. And perhaps just to add, the quantitative researcher is often trying to explain a causal relationship, maybe generalize findings to a larger population, whereas the qualitative researchers usually focus on deeply understanding the actor's perspective, the meanings they construct, typically within a more confined setting or group. They might be studying similar behaviors, but they're using entirely different philosophical lenses and analytical tools to do so.
Okay, so we've mapped out the structural blueprint for conducting the research, and we've explored the two major methodological frameworks for analysis. The final, absolutely crucial stage is the professional presentation of those findings. Academic writing. This isn't just casual communication, is it? It sounds like a highly structured performance of knowledge.
That's an excellent way to frame it, yes. Academic writing is the specific, formal style used across universities, research institutions, scientific publications, journals, monographs, edited books, and so on. And while, yes, it involves the basic act of putting words on a page, it adheres to very specific, often non-negotiable rules regarding content, structure, tone, and style. You could do world-changing research, but if it's poorly communicated, poorly written according to these conventions, it ultimately fails the final test of the academic process. It won't get published, or the thesis might not pass.
So what specifically does this formal style need to demonstrate to really elevate it to that required postgraduate standard? What makes it academic?
Well, it needs to demonstrate profound intellectual synthesis and a real mastery of the subject area. It must show clear evidence of a comprehensive understanding of diverse ideas. It needs to prove the researcher is fully informed by and engaging with the existing academic literature and the key scholarly debates in their field. Furthermore, it has to provide a clear, perhaps original interpretation of key concepts. It needs an accurate, precise description of the research issue itself. And critically, it must trace the issue's relationship with its broader context, maybe its historical development, its present implications, potentially its future trajectory. It needs that depth and contextual awareness.
That sounds like quite a demanding intellectual mandate. Can we sort of crystallize the strict requirements? What differentiates this formal writing from, say, a newspaper article or maybe an opinion piece?
We can certainly consolidate these into a kind of checklist. Academic writing absolutely must be formal in tone and vocabulary. It must be unbiased, strictly neutral. It needs to be exceptionally clear and precise in its language. Tightly focused on the specific research question or argument. Well-structured, typically following established conventions like the IMRAD format, introduction, methods, results, discussion, though this varies by discipline. Critically, it must be well-sourced, using only verifiable, reliable, credible academic sources. And finally, it has to be technically correct, grammar, spelling, punctuation, and absolutely consistent in things like terminology and citation style throughout the entire document. Contrast that with non-academic writing, which might permit a personal voice, rhetorical flourishes, emotional arguments, anecdotal evidence, all elements the academic researcher must rigidly exclude.
Now, for many master's and PhD students, especially when they're just starting out, the sources mention that the biggest hurdle is often simply knowing what's expected, knowing where to even begin the writing process. How do you overcome that initial, sometimes paralyzing challenge?
Yes, that starting hurdle is very real. It requires preparation and, frankly, a degree of submission to establish best practices. Academic writing is often described as both an art and a craft. The craft part means it improves significantly with sustained practice, with feedback, with revision. To get started effectively, students really must do two things. First, meticulously consult high-quality examples, template articles, or successful theses in their specific field, see how it's done well. And second, they must achieve complete mastery over the stated purpose and objectives of their own study. You can't write clearly about something you don't fully understand yourself.
And presumably this isn't something you do entirely in isolation.
Absolutely not. Working closely with with an advisor or supervisor, getting regular feedback is paramount, especially for a long project like a thesis. And because writing a thesis is such a prolonged commitment, often taking 1, 2, even 4 years or more, time management becomes a core methodological issue in itself. Students absolutely must design and then adhere to a strict outline coupled with a rigorous timeline, setting milestones, tracking progress, because believe me, the years can pass very quickly if the project isn't actively managed.
Okay, let's get into some specifics now. Those technical writing guides and the ethical rules that really separate professional research output from, well, amateur work. What's the absolute first technical step someone should take before they even write the first draft?
This is perhaps the rule that's most often neglected, and it causes so much wasted time and frustration later on. Before writing any substantial text, chapter, article, thesis, the researcher must download, read, and commit to strictly following their specific institutions or their target journal's writing guide or style manual. This guide covers everything technical: margin sizes, font, how to format tables and figures, the required citation style, APA, MLA, Chicago, Harvard, etc., section headings, referencing format, everything. Ignoring this at the start means that when you think you've finished, you face the horrible, time-consuming task of retrofitting your entire manuscript to conform. It's completely avoidable extra work.
Right, get the template right from day one. Okay, next up, ethical writing. Let's move beyond the obvious don't copy and paste rule. What are the more subtle but equally important rules about synthesis and academic honesty at this level?
Yes, this is critical at the postgraduate level. While straightforward plagiarism, copying text verbatim without attribution, is clearly unethical and illegal, researchers also need to be very wary of pitfalls like patch writing. Patch writing is where you take a source sentence or passage, maybe change a few words, rearrange the structure slightly, but you haven't actually digested the idea and integrated it into your own intellectual framework. You're still too close to the original source's wording and structure. Information, ideas, concepts taken from sources absolutely must be fully understood, explained, rephrased entirely in the researcher's own words, and properly synthesized into their unique argumentative thread. The concept might come from the source, but the expression, the interpretation, the framing within your argument must be entirely your own, and clearly attributed, of course.
Understood. And finally, there are rules relating directly to maintaining that rigorous formality and the prescribed perspective or voice of academic writing.
Yes. Academic writing is, in a sense, formal evidence. It adheres to a strict standard, almost like a formal dress code, that leaves no room for personal colloquialisms or casual language. This means strictly avoiding slang, everyday expressions, idioms that might be unclear, or any language that introduces unnecessary subjectivity or informality. Furthermore, and this is a key perspective rule, academic writing must be written almost exclusively in the third person. The use of the first person, I believe I found, or even we argue, is often discouraged, particularly in certain disciplines, and the second person, you can see that, is generally unsuitable. This is because using I or you can inject personal opinion or conversational tone, which undermines the fundamental expectation that the research findings aim for a level of objectivity, perhaps even universality, applicable beyond the individual researcher.
So the third-person voice isn't just a stylistic tick, it's actually a methodological tool to reinforce objectivity and maybe generalizability.
Precisely. It distances the finding from the individual researcher, lending more weight to the evidence itself, to the method, to the results. And finally, just to reiterate, clarity and meticulous detail are paramount throughout. Don't use abbreviations unless they are fully defined upon their first use. Use standard abbreviations consistently thereafter. And the ultimate goal, really, at every single stage, from planning the literature review to writing the final discussion section, is to strive for the absolute highest quality possible. Use the best, most reliable sources you can find. Conduct the most rigorous analysis appropriate for your data, and present the final report in the most professional, clear, consistent manner you can achieve. Quality, rigor, and consistency. Those are the hallmarks of genuine postgraduate scholarship.
This has been a really essential mapping out of the structure, the methodologies, and the etiquette required for advanced research. I think the key tension, the main thread we successfully unpacked today, is that fundamental methodological divide between numerical objectivity on one side and contextual interpretation on the other.
Absolutely. I think we covered how quantitative research really demands that statistical measurement, relies on deductive reasoning, and typically starts by testing a pre-existing theory. And contrasting sharply with that is qualitative research, which demands deep verbal interpretation, relies more on inductive methods, and often ends with the creation of new concepts or theories derived directly from exploring a natural setting. Yet, crucially, regardless of which methodological path is chosen, quantitative, qualitative, or even a mix both, demand that the findings ultimately culminate in that rigorous, disciplined, and studiously unbiased structure of formal academic writing.
Right. And mastering that whole disciplined approach, the systematic planning, the careful selection of quality data, correctly matching the method to the research question, and then that strict adherence to the rules of formal academic presentation. That's really what elevates a student's work from just being a project to being a credible, high-level academic contribution.
That really is the essence of the transition, making that step up to the required postgraduate standard. Now, perhaps one final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. Given that quantitative research typically starts with a theory it aims to test, and qualitative research often ends with creating one, what distinct ethical and methodological challenges might arise when a researcher attempts to successfully integrate both approaches into a comprehensive mixed method study? How do you simultaneously satisfy the demands of numerical generalizability and deep interpretive depth within a single coherent project framework? What are the potential trade-offs?
A fascinating convergence point. That definitely sounds like it requires some masterful methodological juggling. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into academic mastery. We sincerely hope this gives you the systematic structure and clarity you need to tackle your next great research endeavor with confidence.